Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to our webinar on student demand and employer demand. We have with us as a presenter Richard Hewitt, who is the Director of Higher Education for EMSI, and he'll be going through this topic. Before we start, I'd just like to draw your attention to the questions box on your control panel, that if you'd like to pose any questions, we will deal with them at the end of the presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard. Good afternoon, Richard.
Good afternoon, Debbie, and thanks very much for the introduction. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people joining us, and some of whom I know well, others less so, and welcome to you. I hope you find this a useful webinar. As it states in the title, this is a part of a series, and so this will have a follow-up webinar later in the month, and I'll link to the date to that at the end. So we will get an overview of what the topic really is today, and start looking at some of the ways of tackling it, and we'll follow up with more examples and workflows that we could look at in the next webinar. So, as I said, the agenda today, first of all, for those who don't know us so well, I will just give a very brief overview of who we are and what we do, and why it is that we're talking about this topic. Then let's understand what is the problem that we're talking about. So we have student demand, we have employer demand, linking those two together, what's the problem with that, the changing environment in which we're operating, and then looking at the steps that you could be engaging prospective students with on that journey from education to employment. And as I said, this is going to be broken up into further webinars. So we will look at all three today, but we won't cover all of them in detail. And I'll have some links for you at the end, where you'll be able to download more information and reports that we've done, which are relevant to this, and you'll be sent a copy of these slides, so you'll be able to follow those links as well. So who are we? EMSI, just in case you're wondering, EMSI originally stood for Economic Modelling Specialists International. Bit of a mouthful, so we just call ourselves EMSI now. While I'm based in the UK and I'm Director of Higher Education for the UK, we are a US based company. We actually were a spin out of the University of Idaho quite some time ago now, where our founders were doing a lot of impact studies for higher education institutions opening new campuses, and it kind of grew out of that. We're currently owned by the Strada Education Network, which is an American not-for-profit, and it's important to mention this, I think, because it's directly relevant to what we're talking about today, in that Strada owns a suite of businesses, all of which are focused on that journey from education through to employment, and part of their mantra is completion with a purpose, and I think that links actually quite well with the topic that we're investigating through this webinar. So they're quite an interesting organization. If you're interested in the wider discussion over how you make that transition through education, direct education through to employment, it's interesting to have a look at what they're doing in the US and seeing how much of that is applicable here. It's interesting stuff that they're involved with, and different organizations, and EMSI is just one of a number of companies in their suite. So what do we do specifically? So EMSI is all about labour market insight. So what we do is we bring together two different sides of labour market data. We have on the one side structural data that comes from the big government surveys, labour force survey, BRES, etc. And we combine that with other big surveys like Working Futures, and all of those. What we have done is create a taxonomy so that they're interoperable. So all of these data sets can talk to each other. And what makes it slightly different with us is that we go right down to a very granular level of detail. So if you're familiar with industry classifications, SIC codes, or occupational classification, SOC codes, we go to 4-digit level, which means that's a lot of detail. But not only that, we go to local authority level in Great Britain. So that is, again, it's a far greater deal of greater depth of detail than you would get elsewhere, and that's very useful for understanding your local labour market and local economy. What we do is also combine that with big data, and that's in the shape of job posting analytics, and so we crunch and scrape information from the internet of job postings across the country. We update that monthly, and that gives a real insight into what's actually happening in various different industries and occupations and companies. Job postings data is big data, so it's not as robust as the annualized structural data, but if you use the structural data to point you in the right direction, the job postings data is very, very helpful in lifting the lid as to what's happening. And so we've created a way in which all of this data interlinks, talks to each other, so you can take meaning from it and use robust evidence for decisions you're taking, or indeed for what you're sharing with your students, which is really the focus here. We don't only work in higher education, we work across further education, economic development, we work with LEPs, we work with big talent companies as well, so the big global recruiters. So we're bringing all of that together. Obviously, there's a wider context, so government, industry, we've got the TEF, all of that. It's coming together to show that employment outcomes are incredibly important. We have localized industrial strategies happening. All of that ties into higher education, and we are bringing all of the data together that can help provide a backbone for good evidence-based decision making. So that's who we are. That's what we do. But let's talk about the problem that we have in front of us today. So from the title, I've talked about making a link between student demand and employer demand. Why do we need to make a link? Because they're not the same. Student demand is not the same as employer demand, and I'm sure all of you are more than aware of that. And it's a huge issue because universities, as much as they may like to speak to careers, universities depend on student numbers, depends on their student recruitment, and the recruitment has to speak to the desires and interests and dreams of their prospects. And the trouble is that the demands, desires and dreams of their prospects may not align with the desires, dreams and desires of employers at the other end. So is it a fool's game to even try to engage in this? Should we just be understanding what students want to do and focusing on that and tailoring our message just to that? Is it worthwhile even trying to make a link between the two? School students don't know necessarily what jobs they want to do. Maybe their parents, maybe their careers advisors at schools, they don't know what's available in today's job market. They may know their own particular areas very well, the areas they have experience in, or that they had experience of moving through when they went through the system. But things change, industries change, occupations change, and they can change quite rapidly. So actually what the possibilities are and what they might be in a local area, they're not necessarily known by the people who are directly advising the students themselves. The actual data that is available how robust is it? How up to date is it? Sometimes it can be quite generic. It can point you into directions of industry bodies, but or some links, on Google to various places, but it doesn't necessarily give you the real local data as to what's going on. And maybe some of that's available, but is it available in a way that students can digest or their networks digest in a meaningful way? And also, students and prospective students don't maintain necessarily the same career vision. Yes, there will be some 14, 15-year-olds who want to be a doctor and will always want to be a doctor, and that is their vocation and their dream. There are plenty of others who don't know at all what it is they want to do. I count myself as one of those, as a German graduate who now finds himself in information services. So it's it certainly isn't clear necessarily what you want to do. Is that going to lead to a fixed outcome? And even if you think it is, it can change. So that's a really quite significant problem, all of those aspects. But things are changing. So there has been some research that is showing that there is a growing importance in the employability outcomes in students' minds when they're looking at where they choose to study. This data is evidences that. You can see, whether it's in industrial placements or just simply evidencing strong employability. It's interesting when actually, while you can see the trends, the numbers though are still around 50%, and that's back in 2015. So it's looking, well, where are we at beyond that? If we extrapolate that curve, I don't think there are any reasons to expect that it would have bucked that trend at all. Then we're still not looking at a huge majority of students necessarily, but patterns are changing. Certainly a lot of recruitment teams have spoken to me this year saying that the way that students behaved in the last recruitment session did not follow the pattern. So people waiting until they got their A-level grades before entering into the market. We see Cambridge today in the news entering clearing for the first time. So things are changing. And of course, it is on the agenda, and it's on the agenda a lot of the time through other stakeholders, be they through the league tables and TEF, looking at Leo data or Delhi, or the upcoming graduate outcomes survey. It's geared towards making sure that people are in graduate level employment once they complete their degrees. So it is on the news agenda, certainly. It's feeding into how the institutions being regulated and how they're being judged. And of course, therefore, it's in the league tables, and those do feed into student judgments and their networks judgments as to where they should study. That is not going anywhere. There's been a lot of investment made at government level in Leo and graduate outcomes, and that's not going to disappear. And it's hardly surprising, because they need graduates to be earning graduate level salaries in order to pay off their student loans. So for the whole system to work, they need students to be going through into careers that will pay. So there is that happening around in the background. And of course, this narrative is happening anyway beyond that. So of course, students, while they're not having to pay up front, they are looking at the level of debt they're leaving with. They're looking at how much they may be able to earn. They're thinking about their return on the investment. There's a lot of talk amongst the student recruitment community about that, and how that conversation is changing. Industry placements remain popular. Degree apprenticeships, again, on the agenda. So while it is not directly linked to what we're talking about today, universities and employers are going out to students and promoting the concept of degree apprenticeships. There is a marketing narrative out there going to young people saying there is another route and the advantages of that route linked to employability outcomes. So that is happening. Fast track degrees, again, the same with 2-year degrees as they come on track, and of course it's early days with that at the moment. But again, institutions will be having conversations with your markets, talking about the advantages of doing a fast track degree, and I would be very surprised if those advantages didn't link to getting into the job market and employability outcomes. And of course, the provision outside of universities, be it from FE providers who run HE programs and alternative providers, very often their programs are vocationally focused. And again, it shifts the conversation there again to careers. So it may not directly feed into the markets that you are talking to. If they're arts graduates or arts students or something like that, it may be quite different. But there is that background noise that's going on, that debate that is widening over what happens after study. So this is all happening anyway. We can't get away from it. So what should we do? I mean, should we make the link as a higher education institution? Clearly, whether you're going to join a degree program that's going to lead directly to a strong career is not the only factor that will impact people's decisions. It's just not only going to be that. There are a whole range of factors, and for each individual, different factors will weigh up in different ways, and their networks will have different priorities and the way those are communicated. So no one here is suggesting that this is a magical solution to changing the decision-making process. But what we're saying is it is an increasingly important factor. And so we're looking at, well, okay, if it's an increasingly important factor, how might we act and communicate responding to this? The other thing that we can think of as non-vocational institutions is we don't necessarily have to think in terms of careers. We could think in terms of skills, because skills are still fit into the context of a career, and you can still link skills to different careers, but you don't have to limit what you're then talking about to a particular occupation or a specific career. So that could alter the narratives somewhat. The difficulty with doing that is if you're then looking to evidence what your claims are, which of course is important these days, the skills data is far more complex because there is no overriding ruling as to how you advertise what skills you're looking for certain positions. There's no agreed taxonomy for how all of this fits together. We have ways of doing it, but it is a far more complex conversation. But it is worth bearing in mind that we don't necessarily have to be tying academic programs to careers. We can be tying them to skills, which we can then tie to multiple careers. So there is a way to make that link as well. We can also think about helping students in that thought process as to what they might like to be doing. So a lot of students have no idea what they're doing. They may have engagement with their careers service, perhaps in year 9, year 10. At what point does your institution start interacting with key schools? What year do you start talking to them? What are you talking to them about? One of the things that you could be doing, and maybe you already do, but is helping them understand how maybe their personalities, their likes and pardon me, their likes and dislikes translate to what could be a career that would be suitable for them, or a type of work, an area of work, an occupation, and you can, pardon me, you can help them develop a career vision. I think it's probably too late to be doing that when they're in the sixth form. That's something that needs development from an earlier stage, and it's not saying it's going to be something that's fixed, but it's getting that narrative going and taking ownership of that narrative. And so some of what we'll be talking about across this series is how you take ownership of that. And of course, answering this question, should HEIs make the link? There is increasing pressure from the OFS and others to tie your provision to graduate outcomes. So I know that that there are people in the regulatory space who are pulling their hair out when they get a new proposition for a certain area of courses without any empirical evidence for demand for that in that locality. And it's very difficult if there's no demand. Well, demand, where is the demand? Well, there might be student demand for it, but is there employer demand? And that is being challenged, and the regulators are going to increasingly challenge that. So it's worth making a link, if only to be able to deal with those issues. So what's going on internally within an institution as well? A lot now, I mean, when you're validating a new program or modules, are they being aligned as part of that validation process? Are they being aligned to regional, national labour market opportunities? Is your university actively responding to that? We see some which are as seeing their role as civic institutions or anchor institutions in their area, working very closely with local industries. Are you understanding what the skills are which are in demand? Are you seeking to meet that demand? Are you ensuring that the course content you already have is remaining up to date? Are you reflecting changes in labour market demand in terms of skills or indeed careers in the modules and programs that you already have? That may all be happening in the background. It's important because it links through to the employability aspect. And of course, if you're trying to promote programs, then actually having programs that do effectively lead to stronger employment outcomes, all of those things are critical, but they're also all internal. And what we're looking at now is, well, how do you take some ownership of the narrative and communicate this to prospective students? Of course, the backdrop to all of this in terms of what's going what can go externally, but also what's being discussed internally, is the labour market insight, labour market information. So the ability to understand what the current employment opportunity is and how your portfolio links to that, the wider graduate labour market demand, identifying skills gaps and gaps in your portfolio where you could be connecting to that demand. So all of that, as I said, links to the labour market information. So how can we use labour market information to help engage those prospective students? We're going to look at 3 steps. We'll focus on one of those today, and we'll briefly cover the other 2, and then we'll revisit those in the next webinar. So the 3 steps could be, first of all, assessing your current course areas. So it's not trying to rebuild everything from scratch. It's taking what you have and understanding how it intersects with the job market. That's really important. You obviously need to be able to evidence what it is that you are talking about. You have to be confident that your portfolio does what it says on the tin, as it were, if indeed you're going to put it on the tin. So you need to look at how your programs link with the job market. Now, how you do that, there are different ways of doing it. So you have to be thinking about the framework for doing that. And you may look at a framework, but also you can look at the reality of it as well, because you know what's happened, or hopefully you know what's happened with those who've completed their programs, either be it through your alumni or your Delhi returns or what have you. The second step is then linking those programs to the employment landscape. So that's looking at, okay, so we know where our programs intersect with the job market. Now let's understand the job market in those areas. And as I said, you could be looking nationally, you could be looking regionally, you could be looking locally, but depending on the focus of your institution, you could do all of that. But okay, so what is the job growth in those areas? What are the graduate earnings? What are the current opportunities? So what's real? What's happening right now? And then finally, and really critical to all of this is, well, how do you communicate all of this? What are you communicating it? To whom are you communicating it? And how are you communicating it? So that is really what this will come down to in this series, is how you get all of this across. But you have to have the foundations in place before you can do that. It is not simply a marketing exercise in itself. It has to be backed up. And the other piece of that is about developing students' career visions. And that helps because it helps you take ownership of the narrative from an early stage. It helps you get that engagement with the students really early on in their journey as they start to think about what it is they want to do. It sets you up as the guide to take them on that journey from in education through to employment, with that program being the vessel that takes them there. And it sets you up as a reliable partner in terms of how you do that. If you're able to be talking about current, real information that's happening now, you're a credible partner who understands the market. People are going to listen to you, maybe take you more seriously, and it's not just the students, but their wider networks as well, which I think is critically important. But we'll cover that in more detail later. So let's look at this first step. Assessing the current course areas. So as you'll know, academic programs are coded according to either JAX codes or HEIs codes, which is really helpful because they're grouped into areas that enable mapping. And it's the mapping process that will allow us then to intersect what you have as a portfolio with the labour market data. So what could we link to? We could link to occupations. So those are the occupational classifications, the SOC codes, or we could link to skills. As I said before at the beginning, linking to skills is a more complex task. SOC codes are standardized government creation that a lot of data feeds into. Skills, we have a taxonomy in order to group skills together, so we can, from our big data, we're able to classify groupings of individual skills as they may appear in job advertisements and group them together into more usable groups that we can then apply to speak to the data and to specific occupations. So there are ways of using skills to map, but it is a far more complex task. Linking through to occupations is a simpler task, but it's certainly not necessarily straightforward, and this is something that, as I said, you need a framework to be doing this. So if we take, for example, JAX H3, which is mechanical engineering, you may have various programs that fall into that category. B-Eng applied mech-eng, B-Eng mech-eng, or a master's mechanical engineering. So all of those could come under that JAX code. And you think, well, okay, which are the occupations which are then likely to be compatible and destinations for people with that type of qualification. And so here what we've got are some example of SOC codes. So 2122, mechanical engineers, but also 2126, design and development engineers, 3422, commercial and industrial designers, and we're able to look at the compatibility of those occupations to that particular qualification, and we're able to give it a direct match in terms of how compatible it is, so we can give it a rating. Sorry. So we can do that, and so we're creating baskets of SOC codes which would be relevant to particular programs. Another way of doing it, or an additional way you can look at it, is actually looking at the actual destinations of those who have completed JAX H3 programs. So you could be looking at your Delhi returns, your alumni profiles, and so forth. And I think this kind of data is something that I know universities are really keen to really build out internally, and investing a lot of money in doing so. And it's really helpful because it may show some slightly different destinations that you may not have picked out. So you may have picked out service engineers or engineering managers, but project managers, 2424, project management professionals, would that have come out of that process? And so there is decision making that has to happen as to how you want to address this institutionally. Whether you want to have wider groupings, whether you want to have very specific groupings according to the closeness of the program to the occupations. Do you want to have a wider approach that may be skills based, which then would have to map back into occupations? It's possible. It's just a larger task, but that can give a wider degree of occupations that you could be looking at. Or do you simply want to keep it quite straightforward, and then just make sure your communications caveat that to say, if you're going into these careers, then which are linked to this program, this is what you can expect. It depends on the academic approach, the strategic approach you have, the marketing approach, so I'm not saying there is one way you particularly should do it or have to do it, but it's a conversation that needs to happen internally, and it's actually quite good that these conversations happen differently in different institutions, because that helps with differentiation, and that's good for everybody. So the next step will be linking those programs to the employment landscape, and as I said before, you'd be creating this basket of SOCs and skills, and then you're mapping that to either your regional or your national data, or indeed to both, depending on the marketing approach, the recruitment approach that you have. It's worth bearing in mind that I think it's around 65% of students end up in a job in the region where they study. I think that's what the data says. And certainly the further north you go, the higher that percentage. So that is worth being aware of. Whether it's what students dream of when they're thinking about going to university, that's another question. Maybe they're not thinking of work in the local region. Again, maybe the national data is useful, putting those two side by side. Again, it's a conversation to be had. Either way, once you've decided where you're looking at in the country, and that's important because the data is very different for different localities, you then need to be looking, okay, what are the job openings? What are the graduate earnings for those types of careers, what are the skills being demanded by the employers in those regions that you've selected, and who are those employers? Who is actually demanding those positions? So you need to be able to collect all of that data and bring it together. And this is why, as I said, that internal dialogue is important, as to making sure when you're validating programs and your program portfolios, you have the employment market in mind. Because if it turns out that actually you've got a suite of programs, all of which have very negative, or maybe not all of which, but many of which have very negative employment outcomes, then you're not going to be able to take this approach at all. So it really is something the institution needs to be on board with altogether, because if it's just a recruitment team doing this and they're on board with it, and then you're looking at your suite of programs and you're finding actually that the data isn't great, well, it's fantastic you're able to feed that back to your colleagues, and one would hope that institution not so siloed that it is possible for that process to happen and that people listen. But you would hope that there would be some response to that. But anyway, hopefully these conversations, and my experience from talking to people in sector is these conversations are absolutely happening internally, and that there is a huge shift to focus on that. So that's the second step, is once you've got those baskets of skills, then collecting all the data that's pertinent to those occupations. Then it's about communicating that, and communicating will involve several different areas. So engaging, so whether it online, through your website, so what job data do you have on your program pages? What employment data do you have that's relevant to your courses? Any earnings data, do you have any of that? Is it up to date? Is it current? Do you talk to students directly? At what point are you doing that? And I talked about maybe at sixth form that being too late in terms of thinking about their career vision. What about their partners? So maybe if it's not with the students directly, but the various career services within schools or other wider partners that you may be engaging with, do they have that data? Are you able to feed that data to them? Coming back to that career vision, so enabling students. So students tend not to know what the job, young people tend not to know exactly what the labour market looks like. Plenty of people who've been in the labour market for decades don't know what the labour market looks like outside of their own area, and why should they? And everyone is unique, everyone is different, everyone has a different experience of life. And so helping students find their own their own path of where they are likely to fit best in that labour market, helping them do that is hugely valuable. So do you have a way to help them get from, well, they know they like these activities or these academic fields, to thinking, well, what that might look as a career and the different ways to achieve that career, and there may be different choices of programs they could have with your institution to get to that. But first of all, how does their personality, how does that translate into a likely fit with the career? Are you enabling them to do that, to develop that career vision? Are you involved in that debate, in that conversation as an institution? Informing, so getting that information to the students. So you have all of this careers data, you have all this labour market data, you're getting it to them. How are you getting it to them? Are you communicating to them about that return on the perceived investment that they're making in terms of that student debt that they see that they're going to be having? And of course, setting up your programs as guides to students through to their careers. Is that how you're establishing your programs? How do they fit in on that journey? Is it a gateway? Is it a journey? How do you position that? And again, there are different ways of looking at that, but again, it's possible to feed in the data to support all of these links in order to make that a more credible and robust case. So that really covers what I wanted to talk about today. We'll look at that second step with next time, looking at some examples of how we can draw out that data and what that might look like and what that might mean, and then how we would potentially communicate that to students. And we can look at some examples of how this is already being done in the wider education sector and maybe take some inspiration from that. And so we'll build that out and see, okay, what can we do and how can we take that forward? And of course, I'd be interested in your feedback before the next session, and maybe I'll be able to respond to that in the way that we build out those next webinars. In the meantime, to find out more, the next webinar is going to be at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, the 27th of March. So we will send out a link to you for that. But please do save the date. We have additional resources here as well. So as I said, you are going to get a link to with all of these slides. You'll be able to click on here and download these different reports. Some of them are about what you're doing internally. Some of it is about how you are responding to the wider environment, and some of it is about communicating that. So all of it relevant and I hope interesting. So do have a look at those. And we have our conference in May, and I know some of you on the webinar are going to be coming to that. Please do come along. I assure you it won't break the bank. A very reasonably priced conference, but it's really interesting. It's looking at the skills of the future and how we decide, okay, well, what are those skills likely to be, and then how do we develop and deliver to that? So highly relevant to what we're doing, and please do share with colleagues. Again, that slide links directly to our conference page, so you're able to register. So please do talk to us. I know I don't know, Debbie, do we have any questions now?
Yes, yeah, we have one question. We have, how do you feel the FE and HE market differ in their use of data associated with employer demand? That's something you can answer now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good question. So to be honest, a lot of FE is all over this. They do a lot of really good work in terms of linking their local labour markets to their programs, but they've had to do that because they've not been able to continue their existence unless they've spoken to the local labour markets. That's what they've all been about. It's what their funding is linked to. They have to make those links in the way that HE has been able to avoid to some extent. Also, the nature of the programs being vocational, it's easier to do it, to be frank. So let's take plumbing, for example. If you do an FE program in plumbing, then the likelihood it's in order to become a plumber and extracting the data from the local labour market about plumbing opportunities is far more straightforward than perhaps what a university might be doing. But just because some of those mechanics are easier, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And actually, FE colleges have been doing this for quite a while, and we've been working with them for really a number of years now, and not just here, but in the US and Canada as well. And so the way in which they're doing all of this is becoming increasingly sophisticated. And so what we're able to do is apply some of the learnings from from them and see what is transferable across to higher education. And indeed, in the next webinar, looking at how you use the data and how it's applied, we'll look at some examples, and we will take some examples from FE to see how they do it, and we'll consider how that transfers across to the HE context. But some of it is harder to do, but it's very much something that still is possible to do, and is, as hopefully I've made the case, is well worth doing.
Great, that's great. Thank you, Richard. And there's no other questions, so thank you very much for today.
Thank you.
And goodbye, and thank you for attending the webinar. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.